Welcome to the Feminine Frequency, a podcast designed to awaken your feminine energy, elevate your confidence, and embody your authentic expression. I'm your host, Amy Natalie, women's empowerment coach, feminine embodiment guide, and author of The Feminine Way. Each week, you'll receive a new episode filled with feminine wisdom, inspiration, and practical tools to remind you of the power that already lives inside of you. Make sure to hit subscribe so that you don't miss an episode, and go to the link below this video to download your free Empowered Feminine Morning Ritual. Ready to dive in? Let's do this, sister. Hello, Inga. Welcome to the Feminine Frequency.
Thank you, Amy. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. And it's really cool that we are recording today on International Women's Day. And it's so interesting that we're recording now because you and I met pretty much a year ago at Envision Festival. And when you reached out and shared what you're up to in the world, I was like, yes, this message needs to be heard. And I feel like this would be so valuable to have you on the podcast to share with my community. And one of the things that I really want to share is that, when I met you, I didn't know any of your story, and your essence and your spirit is so bright. It brings so much joy and so much pleasure to the world, even just to be in your presence. And like knowing your story and understanding a little bit more about what you've been through, it brings a lot of like hope, and it also brings a lot of respect. Like I'm so inspired by who you are, especially because of what you've been through. And so today I feel like is going to be such an empowering conversation. And even though the topic of grief, which is what we're going to be talking about today, might not be like the sexiest topic, it is something that every single woman will experience in her lifetime. It's something that every human will experience in our lifetimes. And it's something that we're really not equipped to navigate. And it's something that can really be one of the most transformational times in our life. And so I'm excited to have you share a bit about your story and share what you're up to, because this is so needed right now. So thank you again for being here. And yeah, what a topic to really devote yourself to and to be in service to at this time. And I'd love for you to share a little bit, your relationship with grief. What is it about your own journey that has brought you to creating spaces for women to feel supported in this area?
Wow, Amy, what an introduction. You're like touched my heart to core. I also want to say that first time I met you at Envision, your radiance was just so present. And I was like, wow, this woman is amazing. I want to keep in touch with her. And I've been following your podcast, I think, ever since I found out about it. So thank you for having me here. And yes, you're very right to say that grief is not sexy and it's not spoken enough about. Um, and I guess I can give you a little bit of background of how I started this online and offline community, basically providing safe spaces for people to welcome grief into their lives, learn to heal, but most importantly, as a result, to live more fully, to live more brightly, and yeah, just really enjoy the rest, of what we have. Um, all of my experiences have really led me here to be in this position to start this community. And I guess to mention, my first exposure to grief was actually losing a dog. I think I was 7, 8 years old. I then also changed schools. I changed homes. My parents divorced, and this was all up until the age of 11. This was before even my first loss. And what's interesting about that is that we typically think of grief as losing someone we love physically in this realm. But I've come to learn that actually grief can show up in all different shapes and forms and different parts of our life, including some examples that I've just provided. But my first significant loss was my mom. I was 14 and I have just left Latvia to study abroad in the UK. And it was, I think I was only 1 month into my school, into new school. And that was really hard. And I then also lost my grandmother 10 years after that. And so my grandmother, who was my mom's mom, basically took over my mom's role. She was like the second unconditional love and care giver. And even though I was a little bit older, 24, I still think I didn't really know how to grieve. I mean, I definitely didn't know how to grieve at 14, and yet alone at 24. Um, and I think, you know, now that we're talking, it's International Women's Day, and I'm looking back at my life, I've lost two very significant female role models quite early into my life. And I almost think that that also affected quite a trajectory kind of my life, and like the energy that I ended up being in, especially in my early 20s, pretty much through all my 20s. And what I mean by that is that I remember at university, I had most of my friends were male. I ended up in a super male dominated environment, which was tech startup industry. And I really lost touch with the feminine. Like I think I was just basically kind of like a tomboy. And
Mm,
I was very much in my masculine pretty much most of the time. So
yeah.
it was, yeah,
Yeah, and I'm glad that you really spoke to that aspect of how your journey with loss and grief, and especially, losing two women in your life, how that has impacted or had impacted your relationship with the feminine. And I think it's so important to speak about this because grief can often put us into survival mode, and especially when you don't have the female role models to be looking to for guidance. It's like the default in the world that we live in is the masculine, right? It is that logical linear thinking. It's the I have to hustle, I need to get stuff done. And so I'm hearing from you that that had a big impact on the way that you related to your feminine energy. And the other piece that I want to share is, when we don't know how to deal with emotions, we don't know how to feel grief, we often shut down our emotions. And that is also part of turning off our relationship with the feminine as well. So, yeah, I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about, what was your relationship with grief early on? Like, how did you deal with grief, if you did at all? And what does it look like now?
100%. I mean, you've pretty much mentioned already some of the elements of how I very much didn't really deal with grief. I was very much in a survival mode at 14 and very much in escapism mode, I would say. And there's nothing wrong with that. I didn't know better, and that's okay. But I pretty much spent, I would say, a good part of like 15 years, maybe just under 15 years, in distraction mode. I made sure that I studied hard and that I got good grades, that I got, I worked in tech startups, like I worked, a lot. And I distracted myself with physical challenges, traveling, relationships, you name it, like hobbies, interests, everything. Like my diary would probably look like about 80, 90% full when I lived in London. And there was no space to feel, to connect, to slow down, to even just be. And so you like you said, I was very much predominant in my male, like in my masculine energy. And even the relationships that like back on, I think in my 20s, I was the man in the relationship. When I read the book, Men Are from Venus and Men Are from Mars, Women Are from Venus. I was like, wow, I was a fixer. I was always a fixer. Um, and so, and another thing where you mentioned suppression of emotions, a lot of suppression. And I've also come to realize after doing a lot, starting doing a lot of therapy, working with somatic practitioners, that I've suppressed a lot of anger, a lot of different emotions in my body, and I'm stiff and I have aches and I have pain in parts of my body where I shouldn't at this age, right? Like I shouldn't be aching in my knees or like having really tight shoulders or neck and things like that. So it's been a journey. I think the biggest difference for me was when I lost my dad at 31. I've already started working with therapists prior to that. And so I was already developing my self-awareness. And I knew that the way I didn't grieve or grieve, so to speak, with my mom and grandmother, I didn't want to do that with my dad. So I knew that I wanted to do the polar opposite of, in this and with this experience. And that means not distracting myself, not running away from the pain, really leaning into it and actually welcoming the grief. So that's been a very different journey for me. It's been a very, yeah, almost like a rediscovery of myself within that.
Mm. I really want to honor you for this new way that you are courageously showing up to be with grief, because grief is one of the most challenging experiences, challenging emotions. And it's not just one emotion. Like grief itself has like a very low frequency, meaning that it's very dense and heavy. And there's so many other emotions, like you just mentioned, anger, sadness, regret, resentment, like all of that is coupled into grief. And I imagine that in not processing your grief around your grandma and your mom and not having the tools really to do that, the passing of your father then opened up, so much emotion that when you have been suppressing it for so long, that emotion is still in your body. Like you shared, that emotion still lives there because you haven't processed it and you haven't moved through it. And so, now that you're courageously being like, okay, I'm doing this differently. I'm willing to welcome the grief. I'm willing to sit with the grief. There's some backed up emotion there that needed to come to the surface. So, is there anything you want to share about that for anyone who's listening who maybe has had a similar experience where they're like have been distracting themselves or avoiding or numbing, and now they're wanting to do things differently, but they feel afraid because there's a lot there to sit with?
Yes, I mean, I definitely noticed that with the passing of my dad and what you mentioned, I was not just grieving my dad's death, but it was a combination of my mom as well, because now it was almost like I am grieving no parents, right? Like I have no parents, and I almost had like a double hit of that. And it was hard for sure. But I made sure, I think this time around, the one thing that I made sure is that I had all the support toolkits and all the support and the guidance and the sisterhood around me to really help me through this, like through for the last, like I would say 2, 3 years. Because when I was 14 and even I think up until 26, I internalized everything. I went completely inwards. I tried to process everything myself. I cried by myself in a room. I was never public. And I think that also didn't help me, that really, that was hard. I think some of the things that, I mentioned that helped me on this journey, to feel things through is I used some of the elements that we have available to us, things like nature and grounding, and that almost like was recharging me and giving me energy to be able to process some of the emotions that would surface, big or small. I mean, I worked with a variety of different therapists, from IFS as well to somatic therapists, and they all had their amazing influence on my healing journey as well. But even things like some of the tools in biohacking, like ice baths and breath work and temazcals, like which are like
Sweat
similar to
lodge.
like
Yeah.
sweat lodges, saunas.
Yeah.
All of these elements, they help you to feel things. They bring things up, but then you always are in a kind of supported environment when you do them. And I think that's really, really important. I think the community aspect and the sisterhood is pretty much primal to my healing. Like when I lost my dad and I took some time and I restarted my nomadic journey, I kept encountering these women who lost fathers as well. And I was just like, this is crazy. Like, what are the chances? But then, of course, energetically, I'm attracting what I'm going through myself right now. And the universe is just constantly presenting me these other examples of other women. And it actually what made me realize, like, wow, wouldn't it be incredible to actually create something where we can all come together and support each other through this very specific journey of losing fathers.
Mm,
So yeah, sharing circles really helped me. Being part of community really helped me, and be leaning on other women and leaning on other people really helped me. And not being afraid that I'm not going to be a burden or that I'm too much or anything, and just trusting that other people are there to help me too and support me
mm.
through this journey.
Yeah, there's so much that I want to highlight there, and we'll start with the community piece because grief and just any emotions, I guess, other than being happy or feeling inspired and feeling on top of the world, it's like we can have so much shame around feeling grief or feeling sadness, and like you said, it can feel like we're being a burden, maybe you're afraid of being judged, and that shame causes so many people to isolate. And I think therapy is a great tool. However, community where you can be around other people who have had a similar experience is really important. And something that I've heard from people who are who are going through grief and or who are even in addiction is sometimes they don't actually feel like they want to be part of these support groups because they feel like it's going to be really negative and it's going to bring them down more and it's just going to be too heavy to be in that. And so I want to circle back around to that in a moment because I think there's a way that we can be in community where it can be a really supportive space that doesn't have to feel that way. But I think especially with grief, like it's a challenging one because in our culture, we're not really taught how to support people with grief. And a lot of people get really uncomfortable. They don't know how to be with someone who's grieving. So they either say the wrong things or they avoid it altogether because it's uncomfortable. And so I want to bring that forward in this conversation of like why it's so important to have spaces that are designated for this so you can get the right support.
Yes, absolutely. And I understand, because even some of my friends, I remember after losing dad, and even some of my closest friends, they honestly shared with me that they never lost anyone, so they don't really know how to even start a conversation around it. But one thing, maybe for anyone who's listening who would like to maybe know or just have an advice of like how you can support someone who's grieving, it really is pretty simple, because all you want to do is focus on the basics. And the basics, what I mean by that is coming to someone and cooking them a meal, a nourishing meal, or taking them out for a walk, or buying them some things for the house that they may, because like you said, we're in completely survival mode when we lose someone. We're in the shock denial stage. We can't think straight. We're probably not sleeping well either. There is like a whole cocktail of things happening in our psyche, in our body. So really just looking after someone with basic, like, to support them through that is, I think that is one of the most simplest things that you can do. And then in terms of the conversation, one of the things I read when I was, doing research is actually, a good question to ask is not how are you doing, because that's pretty generic. Is actually asking someone, how are you surviving since your, dad died?
Mm,
And that drops in the depth of someone being like, wow, I think you actually understand what I'm potentially going through.
mm.
And I really liked that question. And I was like, wow, that's very helpful if someone uses that. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I've had experiences where I've had the gift of supporting some of my dearest sisters when they're going through grief. I have a sister who lost her mom, and we were very close during that time. And one of the things that I learned, and it makes me emotional thinking about this, is that you don't actually have to have the right thing to say. You don't have to know how to fix it. That's not your job. Being there for someone who's grieving could be as simple as like, hugging them or sitting next to them and holding their hand. And like, there doesn't actually have to be words. It's like your company and your care and your presence is all that really matters. And you don't, it's not your job to fix it or to take away their pain. It's your job to love them and to be present with them. And like you said, if there's basic needs that, they need, bringing them food, making sure that they have the support that they need, maybe even connecting them with the right people for support if they're ready for that. I think that's huge. So yeah, I love this conversation of like, how can we actually support people who are grieving? And um I want to presence that one of the areas of grief that we haven't touched on where it can show up is in relationships, relationships ending, going through a divorce. I remember when I was going through my divorce in my late 20s, like that was the first time that I really let myself grieve, really let myself cry. And I was grieving my relationship with his family. I was grieving my
Mhm.
relationship with him. I was grieving like the future that we had together, even though it was my decision and I knew that it wasn't in alignment for me to be in that relationship. And one of the things that helped me the most is, at the time I was living at my parents' house because I was still paying part of the mortgage and going through the process of separation. And every single morning I would go down to the ocean, and every single sunset I would go down to the ocean, and I would just sit there and I would cry, I would laugh, I would just like be in silence with myself. And there's something so healing, and that really helped me to feel like I wasn't alone. For me, like sitting on the cliffside and looking out over the ocean and looking at that horizon, it's like there's something greater that created this. Like this is so powerful to sit here and to witness the sunset and the sunrise, and to know like I'm not alone. And so I feel like that in itself, what you shared about grounding and being in nature is so healing and so important, because hibernating in your house and being indoors and being in that like kind of stagnancy without the fresh air, I think can make things worse.
Yes, 100%. I agree. And I think, I want to comment on something you mentioned about just being there for someone, and not necessarily having a conversation, and just the present itself, and what we call space holding, right? Like just sitting with the emotion. I mean, still some people might find it difficult, because even space holding can feel quite heavy. And as we know, we have, some individuals absorb other people's energies and kind of emotions, and others are able to protect their energy field so they don't take it on. And I think that's why having a dedicated space, something that I created with Welcoming Grief, is so important, because everyone who joins our online sessions, for example, have gone through a very similar experience, and we hold the space as a collective. So it's not just me holding the space, but we're holding it as 10, 15 participants at a time, and people feel really able to share their story, to be vulnerable, to cry, to laugh, to just be. I think that's the most important part, to just accept whatever you're going through right now is good. It's not even okay, it's good. um yeah, we've had I just want to share, like, a couple times when we run these online sessions and space holding, we have some participants saying, like, I've not felt anything, and like, why am I not feeling anything? I want to feel some emotions. And we're like, that's also okay. Like, that's also okay that you're not feeling anything right now. And just giving yourself permission to accept all the parts of yourself. And I guess that is the feminine way as well, right? It's about really giving yourself the space and the slowness and the time and the permission to be anything that you're experiencing, and not necessarily expecting an outcome to happen, or expecting an emotion to surface. um yeah.
Yeah, so beautiful. And that really is it, is bringing compassion and acceptance to where you are in the moment, instead of being in the mind, like, I should be feeling differently. I should be responding to this differently. I'm a bad person if I'm not feeling X, Y, and Z. There's something wrong with me if I can't feel. And, the truth is that first, we're not ever taught in our culture how to hold these big emotions. We're actually taught the opposite. We're taught that big emotions are bad, that we need to shut them down, that they're inappropriate. You're being too loud. This is not okay. And so we've been taught to shove all of this down, to not feel. And then on top of that, if your nervous system isn't ready to feel these emotions, your body's actually protecting yourself until you're ready, until you're resourced. So
Mm.
that numbness is there for a reason. And if we judge the numbness or criticize yourself for not having the emotion, it actually makes it worse and it makes it harder to come to be expressed. And I love what you're the name of your mission, welcoming grief. It's like welcoming all of the aspects of it, not making any of them wrong, being like where you're at right now is perfectly okay. And that's where the healing can happen, when we create that space for compassion and understanding and acceptance for what is.
100%. Yeah, and I love that you talk about the self compassion and also practicing self love. It's some of the core practices that I been pretty much rediscovering and relearning in the last 3 years. Actually, mostly thanks to other women in my life who've really almost like mirrored or helped me to just reflect on things. And yeah, what you mentioned, I remember 6 months in after my dad, I remember, oh, there's been a month that I haven't thought about him or I haven't cried, and I started to feel guilty, and I started to feel so bad, and I was like, wow, like, am I even, who am I? But thanks to my therapist, thanks to my friends, thanks to the woman, um, I realized there's no right or wrong way. There's just a way. And grief is so individual. It carries such an individual formula for each one of us. It's pretty much like love. There's no same formula for love for you and me, we're all going to experience it in our own unique and yeah, unique in various ways. So it's important that we practice self-compassion, or practice self-love as a way of being with grief. And if you think about, allowing people to lean into grief, kind of the mission that I'm working on right now is very much being in the feminine. It is, because it's very much about us being present. It's about us, leaning in. It's about us connecting with the emotions, not running away, not actioning anything, just being, and being vulnerable, being raw, being open, being willing. All of these elements are so the feminine. And it's definitely been a beautiful journey for me to see how grief actually helped me also be in my feminine more.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, because earlier you said that this is about, really connecting to your aliveness. It's not just about the
Mm,
grieving itself, but the actual purpose of this, and the reason why you've created this space for welcoming grief is to be connected to life. And I've talked on this podcast before of like, if we want to experience the states of bliss and pleasure and joy, we also have to be willing to feel these states of grief and sadness and frustration. And so, yeah, what has your experience been as you've processed some of these deeper emotions and released some of the grief from your body? Like, what has shifted for you in your life, and how has that allowed you to be more in your feminine?
for sure. I think the biggest difference was with me, like how I approached my grieving with dad is all about like leaning and welcoming everything that arised. And I've noticed that um I remember I was in Oaxaca a year later, actually where I'm right now, and I spent the Muertos here, like Dia de los Muertos, and also I think being here in that time, seeing the vibrancy, the colors, the celebration of death, and being also on this journey was like really shifted my whole perspective about grief and death. And I was like, wow, it doesn't have to be so dull and heavy and grim and not spoken about. It can be such a beautiful process. And when I think about my journey, because I've been so much more conscious with my grief, I've allowed to create more spaciousness in my body and actually feel lighter and actually see the beautiful side of grief. And I know for some people it might sound really weird, like what beautiful side of grief, but I really believe like there is, like every coin has two sides. And now for me, grieving isn't necessarily, yes, of course I can still get sad sometimes, but now for me, grieving is actually about feeling the energy of my dad within me, remembering him, almost embodying parts of him when I'm with hosting friends or cooking food. And it's all the beautiful side of him that lives within me. And I think I would only really be able to feel all of this if, like, because I've gone through the heavy parts of like my grieving, like the sadness and the, asking why, and, feeling like this is unfair, and so many other things. And yeah.
I feel like what you just shared, like that is what so many women needed to hear as a possibility. And it's interesting, as you said, in Mexico, there's Dia de los Muertos, and that has a celebratory aspect to it. And in all other cultures outside of Western cultures, there's this reverence for death. There's a celebration of this person's life. And I feel like there are some aspects of that here in Western culture, but I do feel like it's something that we have so much fear over, and yet it's something that is so inevitable. And so changing our relationship with death itself, even
Mhm.
before, we pass or someone else passes, I think is so important, because otherwise we're resisting what is. And again, it's not the sexiest thing to like dive into and be like, yeah, I want to change my relationship with death. And even in this conversation, I feel like so much is going to shift for women in their understanding of how they can become more empowered in their grieving, in their process of going through changes. And the last piece that I wanted to share here is also the cyclical nature of life and of relationships. Like some of the hardest quote unquote breakups, like where I've had a lot of grief, is actually with girlfriends when things have shifted, or when
Mm.
I've moved and had to leave things behind. And I think that even these grief portals that we can go into, they do create so much more space for connection and aliveness. So yeah, I just wanted to presence that there's beginning and endings, and the more that we can start to honor that cyclical nature of life itself, instead of resisting it or avoiding it, the more easefully that we're going to be able to move through these really intense times that we have.
100%. And oh my God, that resonated so much. I remember the first really good friend that I decided to take a pause or a break, and essentially we never went back to being friends. It took me years to really go get, actually like accept that. Like that was actually almost like a harder breakup with some of the women that you build relationships with. So I totally hear you. And yeah, I think, if we really think about people coming into our lives, they say, some people come for a day, a month, a year, a lifetime. I really believe in that. I really do. And, when one person goes, we create space for someone else to come in.
Hmm.
And I think in relation to my dad, I think for a while, I really struggled to, accept the fact that he left so early. And I just started rebuilding my relationship with him as a woman, not as a child, but as a woman to an adult to an adult. But I think with time, I realized he went when he had to go. He completed his mission here. He really had. And it's, I'm here kind of, I'm here and I can choose to suffer, but I can also be here to live and honor him and remember him and, live his life lessons and carry his legacy forward, right? So I think we always have a choice to how we think and how we act and what we do with it. Yeah.
I got chills when you were sharing that. Yeah. And And this aspect of letting go of whether it's romantic relationships, friendships, people, there is this great surrender and it requires a lot of faith, right? Like this is not just on the conscious level, like, okay, I'm ready to let go. This is on a spiritual level, it's on a somatic level. Like there's so
Mm.
many layers here. So I feel like this topic is so beautiful. And I know that this is something that our listeners can continue to share with people who they know are grieving. You can come back to this at any time where, you might be going through grief, just to have these reminders. And Inga, I'd love for you to share more about welcoming grief, your vision for what you're creating, and how women can connect with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, I started as an online community first, running online sessions with very specific themes. So one of the themes that we have coming up is for women who've lost fathers, and that's going to be it's kind of like grieving for women specifically. This is our repeat because it was so powerful. It touched my and my collaborators' hearts to a core, and I was like, we have to do this again. We have to provide the space again. And then I also, as I'm rooting in Mexico City, I've also started bringing in-person experiences and events, grief related, but I'm bringing some of the elements that helped me around biohacking and arts and maybe somatics into those kind of healing spaces. But my vision is a retreat at the end of this year. I really want to run a 5-day grief focused retreat with incredible practitioners, therapists, and provide amazing set of tools and a community for people to be able to really work through what they're experiencing. But yeah, it's a really exciting time. I really see like the light, the joy in it. I don't want to, because some people say like grief is so heavy, but I was like, it doesn't have to be. It really doesn't. And if you have the support of other women and a community, it can be a very beautiful experience too. So.
Mm. Yeah, I couldn't think of anyone better to be holding this space, to be guiding this mission in the world. And what I'm sensing for women from the grief circles and the grief retreats is so much liberation and freedom, and to know that they're not alone on their journeys, and that there's so many different tools and resources that they can utilize to come back to life and to, like you said at the very beginning, like enjoy their lives and live the legacy of whoever they've lost, and bring that celebratory joy and love into their experience. So wow, I'm so touched by this conversation, truly, and I know that it's going to serve so many, and that I'm just feeling the resonance of your path and your mission. So thank you for sharing it here. Thank you for being here. Is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners before we wrap up for today?
Wow, I don't even know. No, I just want to say thank you so much for holding this space for me as well today. And yeah, just a reminder that for any women who are listening who have lost fathers, we would love to welcome you on the 10th of April for online session. We'll add the links as you mentioned to the podcast. And for anyone else who would like to actually get involved with Welcoming Grief, because I always collaborate and co-host sessions, whether that be in person or online. Anyone who's gone through an experience of losing someone either suddenly or to illness or different relationships, you can always reach out to me. And if you want to contribute and collaborate with me, I welcome that more than anything. So I think that's
Mm,
probably the last thing that I would say.
great. And where can people connect with you on Instagram as a next step?
It's at Welcoming Grief, but only with one G.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. We'll make sure to link that in the show notes so people get that information and can reach out to you directly. Well, thank you again for being here and for stewarding this mission. And I'm excited to see it grow. This really feels like just the beginning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining me here on The Feminine Frequency. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit subscribe and share it with a friend. For more inspiration, empowerment, and wisdom, come on over and follow me on Instagram at Amy Natalie Co. Have a beautiful rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next video.